Sadism fills our society and our world every day. We may not kill and torture people in the street, however, we seem to enjoy to watch someone get killed, tortured or suffered within a social or private environment. Some of you are probably sitting there and thinking, what is this weirdo on about? But in my opinion, we are all sadists. Horror is a vast and continuous product that us as consumers enjoy to experience because we like to be scared, we like to be on edge, we like to feel anxiety that fills your body with adrenaline, and that is exactly what horror is.
Horror is different things to different people, but generally in media terms it's scaring people. It's using suspense, blood, gore, vicious protagonist, usually a female in some sort of distress, all those iconic things that we expect to see: evening, night, people alone, eerie music, dark shots with lots of shadows. All those sort of things tend to make up the horror genre.
Horror is the category that we assign to things that are designed to scare us. Horror will never stop evolving. To look back at the full story of horror, it's too complex for the information to be processed, but the main fundamentals are a different story. Nevertheless, let's take a look at the key points behind the history of horror. The first recorded evidence that belongs to the genre that is horror can be dated back to the day humans evolved the ability to talk. Scary stories around the campfire, lies parents tell their children to behave, all would involve bats, monsters, ghosts, ghouls, demons, and beasts. These are all seeds that have grown to know what we know today as horror. So where did the first signs of horror develop? In the late 1700s, a new trend of literature was erupting known as Gothic horror, which was developed by talented male and female authors from Great Britain and the United States of America. The term Gothic was taken from the pseudo-medieval buildings, where the stories commonly took place. For example, old castles filled with dungeons, secret passages, and a dark, gloomy forest surrounding the castle. The three most commonly known writers of this genre of literature are Mary Shelley. She was a British novelist, a short story writer, a dramatist, essayist, biographer, and a travel writer. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was born on the 30th of August in 1797 and died on the 1st of February 1851. Shelley is best known for her 1818 Gothic novel Frankenstein, or what was then called the modern Prometheus. Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe was an American author, a poet, an editor, and a literature critic. Born on 19th of January 1809 and died the 7th of October 1849. Poe is best known for his poem The Raven in 1845. Bram Stoker was an Irish novelist and a short story writer. Born Abraham Bram Stoker on 8th of November 1847 and died the 20th of April 1912. Stoker is best known for his 1897 Gothic novel Dracula. In terms of visual entertainment of horror, in the 19th century, before horror stepped in front of any moving image recording device, horror was a collection of images and paintings created by painters and photographers interested in spirit photography of the 1860s. They based their work on the folklore and legends of Europe to form monsters into physical form. Spirit photography is the practice of merging two images together via double exposures to superimpose a subject into a spirit form light. Nowadays, with the help of current Adobe Photoshop software, spirit photography has been easy to produce. The Lumiere brothers created a piece in 1895 called Le Squelette Joyeux, which is French for happy skeleton, and consisted of a skeleton marionette puppet dancing. Although this would seem surreal and more of a cheap, boring commercial video, to the sadist and horror buffs of today, the term of horror was used until the 1930s after such films as Nosferatu. The earliest horror films or horror content captured in shown view cinematography we refer to as spook tales. Maxi Gorky, whose real name was Alexei Maximovich Peshkov, born 28th of March 1868 and died 18th of June 1936. He was a Russian and Soviet writer and founder of the socialism realism literary method. He was also a political activist. Said after watching a short cinematography piece created by the Lumiere brothers, gave this comment towards the new form of entertainment. Last night I was in the kingdom of shadows. If you only knew how strange it is to be there. It is a world without sound, without colour, everything there, the earth, the trees, the people, the water and the air, is dipped in monstrous grey. Grey rays of the sun across the grey sky, grey eyes in grey faces,
and the leaves of the trees are ashen grey. It is not life, but its shadow. It is not motion, but its soundless spectre. Here I shall try to explain myself, lest I suspected of madness or indulgence in symbolism. I was at a mount and saw Lumiere's cinematography, moving photography.
The first official horror film on record is a short French film created by the 1896 called Le Manoir du Diable, which is French for The Manor of the Devil. This film was created by one of the film's earliest visionaries, Georges Méliès. Although the film is just over 3 minutes, this supernatural story still manages to pack into the iconography of the genre that we know as horror. These classical tropes of bats, devils, witches, cauldrons, ghosts, trolls, all appearing and disappearing in the puffs of smoke.
I think it's debatable. To me, I would say it's Nosferatu, purely because it was the one that perhaps went global first and came from a more recognisable studio, and the controversy that was happened with it over the copyright of rewriting Dracula's book. It also is a popular format, Dracula itself, so people knew of what it was, went to see it. It became very iconic in the fact that lots of those sort of shots, many films even today pay homage to that. And it really was the first film, I think, in my opinion, that actually said, well, this is how we do a horror film, from a mise-en-scène point of view.
Gorky's description of flickering images dipped in monstrous grey described the problem with horror films with the technology at hand. Darkness and shadows are such important features of modern horror films, but back in the 19th century, getting this desired effect was impossible to show on the low-contrast film stock available at the time. This created a problem to show the effects of day and night. An example for this would be in the Nosferatu, where the vampire is seen leaping amongst gravestones in what would appear to be broad daylight. In other terms, seeing a vampire running around in the middle of the day would seem to be extremely bizarre to a modern audience. Throughout the evolution of horror, there has been many styles of iconic horror films that have changed horror. For example, in no particular order: Nosferatu, 1922, Frankenstein, 1931, Godzilla, 1954, Psycho, 1960, Night of the Living Dead, 1968, The Exorcist, 1973, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, Jaws, 1975, Alien, 1979, Blair Witch Project, 1999. The types of content being presented in films have changed over the time as a result of advances in technology and changes in society. The reason of increase is because our minds have seen so much thanks to the technology that is put into films. If you felt an audience from the 1930s, where horrors first started, to now watch a film that would be in the late 2000s, imagine their thoughts. What would they think? Is this real?
It's obviously difficult to put ourselves into the mindset of an audience member in the 1930s, say, or 1920s. And what you probably don't realise is that they look quite sort of laughable to us now. Those films were terrifying for audiences at that time. I mean, really shocking. In fact, a whole new category was introduced, H for horror, which didn't previously exist because people hadn't seen this kind of film before. A good example is I was classifying a film from 1932, I think, called The Monster Walks, which was about a sort of gorilla-type creature menacing, a woman in a house, etc., etc. We passed that PG. It's black and white. It looks, it's fairly laughable. You can see the joints, you can see the costume. At the time that came into the board in 1932, it was rejected because it was considered such strong entertainment that it wasn't suitable for adults. So in a way, we're not really comparing like with like. We can look back in time and say, well, those were, quite tame horror films, but of course they had a different impact on an audience that were used to dramas or documentary type films. To them, this was quite shocking and strange, as was the whole sort of medium of cinema. Has violence increased over the years? I think what has changed is that special effects have got better. So what it has allowed is a more convincing realisation of violence, if you like. So a film like Human Centipede 2, somebody's teeth are pulled out with pliers, that looks real. If you're watching it, it's very convincing. It's difficult to tell that it's not real because the CGI is so good. Whereas in the past, some special effects just were a bit easier to spot. Again, though, 70s, 80s films, lots of blood, lots of gore. To the audiences then, those look quite shocking. I mean, I was watching Don't Look Now, a classic horror film, which was originally passed to X. The controversy was about the sex scene in it. But actually, there's a really nasty scene of a throat cutting at the end of a character that you've really come to like, and so you feel it's very shocking. But I watched it again recently, and the blood is pink. It looks like pink paint. It doesn't detract from the horror of the moment, but it's very clear to see the joins in terms of the horror effect. So I think it's difficult to say that films have got more violent, because to each generation that's seen those new films, it seemed like the epitome of horror and violence to them at that time. And there are still films from the video nasties era that still pack a punch. So films like I Spit on Your Grave, Last House on the Left, those kinds of films, the threat in those films is still really strong. It's nothing to do with special effects, it's to do with somebody being stalked and in fear of their life or in fear of rape. And they're still powerful, 18-level type films, now, compared to when they were also first made. So there has been a rise in terms of you are able to show torture in a kind of more realistic fashion, although again I was watching a scene from, I think it was the first Hostel the other day, where a woman gets her eyeball torched and it's kind of snipped off, and that looks very fake now, even less than 10 years on, because special effects again have got much better. But I think you'll come onto this with some of your other questions, but there's always been a demand for horror. People like watching horror films, they like testing themselves against violent imagery. It's part of a staple. People liked fairy stories that scared the bejesus out of them at the time. So it's always been something that people have looked for. So I think, horror films like to keep, pushing the envelope as far as they can.
Foreign horror movies have a way with sometimes being a bit too gory. In result of this, they tend to be banned more than often. So what makes us want to see a banned film? Well, in short term, it's like when you was a child and your mother and father would send you to bed because of a certain horror film. For example, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You wanted to watch it so badly, you would get up before your parents, hoping that it was in the VCR, so you could see what the big fuss was all about and why you wasn't able to see it.
That's a really interesting area. Obviously, we have to apply the UK guidelines to wherever films has come from. And some, as I mentioned in the talk, some cultures have different expectations from film. And who can watch those kinds of films. A good example, one of our very closest geographical neighbours, France, they have a very different approach to film. They pass most films at their most junior category. They treat it as a completely legitimate art form, if you like, to things that we don't censor here, like writing of novels or photography or painting, those kinds of things. And they treat film with arguably more respect in terms of they very rarely kind of censor films. They do have a category that they have as their 12 category, which for us, if I see a film come to us for classification that's got a French 12, I know it's going to be strong. But they reserve that for really their most extreme material, as we have, as you know, more graduations of film. So films that come from abroad, I think it's also to do with a different cultural take. So going back to fairy stories, we have fairy stories that are kind of, we recognise and we're used to, and some of them are European, fair enough. But when you start looking at things like, say, Asian horror, it's very different kind of ghost stories and the supernatural type of work that comes from those sorts of markets. A good example is The Ring, recognised as a sort of quite a groundbreaking film in that it scared British audiences in a way that other films hadn't done before, because of how it approached the subject and the kind of, I suppose, the spookiness it brought to it, rather than just a straight sort of horror film in the way that we might have done. So that kind of film sticks in the mind. And really, all we can do is classify it according to what British audiences might expect their horror to be at, say, 15 or 18. And also, don't forget that audiences have become a lot more film literate in even the last decade, I've noticed. Foreign films, anything with subtitles, was not standard fare here at all, certainly not in cinemas, really not in DVDs, apart from like niche art house. Whereas now, films have really broken the mould. Films like Pan's Labyrinth, Wreck, films that people are willing to have subtitles to put up with what is actually quite superior horror, because it comes from a slightly different angle than UK audiences might expect. So it doesn't pose any particular challenges for us. I mean, you mentioned Grotesque there, because obviously that's a controversial film. It's in a class of its own, really, in that it combined extreme horror, torture, porn-type horror, with sexual violence. And often those two subjects are actually treated quite separately. And it was rare in that it kind of conflated the two, and that made it a problem for our sexual violence policy. And in the end, we rejected it because it kind of failed certain tests that we have for why is sexual violence being placed within a film, what's the reason for it. So in a way, it wasn't felt to kind of explore it in a responsible way that looked at the subject that another film like Irreversible might have done. So it's difficult to say. It's rare that it makes a difference where the film comes from in terms of classification, to be honest, especially at the 18 category. But in terms of what audiences expect, then the differences can be quite strong.
So why do we like violence? Why are we sadists? According to a new study, it may be because they hope it will offer meaningful insights into some aspects of the human condition. Studies suggest that people are not necessarily attracted to violence, but seem to be drawn to violent content because they anticipate other benefits, such as thrill and suspense.
Things that scare us, to some extent, are better for us from an evolutionary point of view than things that are good for us. You need to know what can do you harm more than you need to know what can do you good. It's a bit the way we know smoking's bad for you, but they might tell you now and again that an apple's good for you, but they don't ram it down your throat in the same way that they say smoking is bad for you. So there's something in our psyche that demands that for a start. It's also that feeling that most people don't watch horror films alone. So there is that social inclusion point a bit, that you can talk about it, that you can be scared together and you can remember those memories. It'd be interesting if people did. It'd be interesting to see the research in how many people do watch horror films alone. I think you'd probably find it's not that many. Each generation watches it, because everything is new. Everything is new to you. It's like that old joke, the old jokes that your dad knew when he was a kid, and you hear it and you think it's a new joke and you tell. So every new generation, it becomes a new format. What every new generation does, however, that makes it different is that they impose their own ideology upon that genre and their own use of technology upon that genre. So even if you're making a Dracula film, which happens on Channel 4, is it? Just done that new Dracula, or Sky Living? It is Dracula, but it's Dracula of today. Even though it's still set in Dracula in 1898, it's still Dracula looking at the modern concerns today. So I think that's why. I think it's quite fascinating. We like to be scared.
So, do horror films influence us? How many times have you heard a parent say, "Oh, my son or daughter won't be seeing that film, it's too violent. I don't want them growing up like that." Like what? Chances are that with the world the way it is, your child will see something more violent on the news. Truth is, yes, some movies are too violent for young audiences, but by banning them from their lives entirely, you're just giving them a reason to seek it out and want to see it more. Horror movies are an escape. It's the reason they are so popular. Without leaving the comfort of your own living room, you can enjoy watching some madman rip apart a bunch of teens without any remorse, and you don't have to feel guilty about enjoying it.
Yeah, I think that's the difference, is we get to hear things. It's sensationalism as well. That thing in the press, if it bleeds, it leads. We're more interested in bad news than we are in good news. We get to hear of it more. There's nothing that's been done on film that hasn't been done in real life. But getting to hear about it, I'm not saying we should hear about it in real life, certainly not. We know that there's been a psychological study saying that women shouldn't watch the news, late night news, because they take that worry to bed with them. And maybe watching nasty video films and nasty films late at night might affect your psyche. But generally, most people are fairly well grounded. It's the ones that aren't. And unfortunately, the ones that aren't probably don't have the parents that do the policing of what they're watching. So there is a cause for concern. But should we stop something that's harmful to a few if it gives great pleasure to a lot? I don't know.
horror has changed people in the last few years?
I think it's changed people quite a lot, because if you go back to the original horror films, which is Nosferatu, which is the original Dracula, then you got Dracula and Frankenstein and so on. It's just, most of their films is you don't actually see, like for example Dracula, you don't really see Dracula that much. It's more about the legend and the scared